right. So,
well, cheers.
I'm distracting you.
Nice to see you.
Cheers. Yes, and coming all the way.
Well, no. Well, thank you for coming all the way. Sort of generic question: Why the new book, the Missing Lands, which I read, I love, and I'm actually beginning to reread now because there's a lot. There's a lot to him. But it's fantastic because it joins all the dots, isn't it? It actually takes the myths and the indigenous wisdom, and it kind of marries it with the modern scientific discoveries, which seem to authenticate the two stories. And so it's actually, and voila, you've presented basically a coherent picture of what happened 11,000 years ago.
Yeah, because there's been a lot of writers that have talked about the ancient civilization angle, and the fact that there was someone here when the Younger Dryas was going around, and we were just a bunch of hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
But they didn't have all the information. They had some of the information. So we're kind of building on the shoulders of other giants, and what I wanted to do is put a human touch to it, because we talk about Atlantis, we talk about Lemuria, but this seems abstract.
Yeah.
It's like something lost in time. Maybe it's myth. Well, yes and no. I mean, you have to understand what myth is all about. Myth is a theatrical device to tell a story, which is factual.
Yeah.
You just have to understand the symbology behind the myth, and also you have to understand the language in which it was written. Once you unravel that, you can basically start extracting the information. It's a bit like King Arthur and the Knights of the Holy Grail. It's a myth. Well, actually, no, it's partly true and partly metaphor and partly symbolic. You can extract the path of the initiate, how the universe works, the path of the zodiac and the sun through the zodiac, and that's just the top of the list in terms of the Knights of the Holy Grail. But that's a remake of the story of Jason and the Argonauts, and it's a remake of the Isis and Osiris story. There's nothing new under the sun.
Yeah.
So once you understand that, and you start looking at the old myths about sunken continents, what I wanted to do was put some meat on the bone. Who were these people? Were they connected in some way? Here we heard about Viracocha and all the gods that appear out of nowhere in South America. There's a bunch of people that appear in Central America who are very tall and white-skinned, which is a bit weird in Yucatan. And then you hear about this all around the world, and I think, were these people all connected? Were they part of the same brotherhood? And if so, how come they just suddenly show up in the middle of nowhere, on the coastline, as though they were master seafarers, and they knew about the stars, they knew where they were going. Just like you and I go shopping at the supermarket, for them it was easy to get around from A to B. And I wanted to find out what links all these people together. Where did they live? Where did they come from? And I didn't go to the extraterrestrial route, too easy, and hard to prove as well. And I began to do some quiet research on the traditions of the ancient people, because so much of our history comes from an Anglo-Saxon European point of view. Totally biased. It still comes from that colonial attitude that we know better than anybody else, and these savages. Well, it turns out when you talk to these savages, they know a hell of a lot more than we do. And I let them talk. The book's about their story. It really kind of starts around New Zealand, with the people we've never heard of called the Waitaha, how they predate the Maori, which is a very politically sensitive issue in New Zealand to begin with, as I found out. Not that I'm trying to undermine the Maori in any way, they had their position in history, but there were people there before them, and they said so when they arrived. We were greeted on the shores of New Zealand by tall, white-skinned people who were blonde or red-haired. Now that sounds a little bit weird. So when I started looking at the Waitaha tradition, they actually remember the flood 11,000 years ago. That's a great story. They talk about the gods visiting them when they were still on Easter Island, before they moved to New Zealand. The gods used to show up every year, and they had double-hull canoes, and then they used to go somewhere. They came from a big land in the east, and then they went somewhere else. I'm thinking, well, if they're in South America with Tiwanaku, And the more I began to look into these stories, the more they overlap people in Polynesia, the more they overlap people in Japan in 8000 BC. And then I began to look into the flood traditions, 184 of them. Once you read 184 flood myths and you go, wow, they all talk about the same thing. And they weren't supposed to talk to each other, by the way, because remember, these were savages, They didn't get around very much. How come they come up with the same story before Europeans show up to tell the story? It's all pre-biblical. And so I figured, okay, these aren't just stories, these are eyewitness accounts that have survived, and all of them talk about there were gods here before, there was an advanced civilization in their own kind, They were able to get from A to B by flying through the air with stone boats, or as the Hopi called them, the flying shields. And you're thinking, okay, someone knew about the laws of nature, how to bend them, but these people kept themselves to themselves. They lived on islands or in locations where humans did not belong. And I thought, well, that would make a lot of sense, because if you and I, even today, we have people who are developed at a different way that we in Western society have. We can go to the middle of the Amazon and find tribes that are still quite primitive relative to us. But in their manner, they're quite happy by themselves. They know their own story, they know how to get around. They probably will survive better than we will if the electricity goes off and the cell phones don't work. They are way ahead of us in that respect. So it was a matter of just looking at all of these people and saying, if I was in a state of advanced civilization, I could defy the laws of gravity and get from A to B using flying boats. I wouldn't want to hang out with humans who are still at the hunter-gatherer stage, because I might interfere with their natural development. Just like we today, interfering with an Amazonian tribe will alter their development. So that's a smart thing to do. But if you start reading the surviving traditions of these gods, they're saying, well, it was our idea to be messengers or middlemen for these other gods that were here in secluded environments. And we would drip feed knowledge to human beings, like go downhill to the hill where the hunter-gatherers are and give them these plants, which are basically wheat and barley, and show them how to cultivate this, and then leave.
Yeah.
Let them, define themselves. Yeah. And that's basically what happened. They would drip feed the information to humans and watch them develop. And that's what fascinated me about the book, is that we had these guardian angels, literally, among us. And then suddenly, after the flood, they left. There were groups that survived, that stayed behind to teach humanity the arts of civilization, and then they disappeared. So the whole point of the book was to find out who they were, where they lived, and were they all connected, were they part of the same brotherhood. So that was the story.
Absolutely. And one of the surprises, apart from finding out that the Waitaha weren't the indigenous tribe of New Zealand, was actually the fact that from the flood myths, rather than these interesting people arriving from one location, what you discovered actually is that they actually arrived from about 7 different locations. Actually.
Exactly. It's always in groups of 7.
Yeah.
And also everything's to do with 7.
7 plus 1. Occasionally, so the sages. So you'd have spotted that you actually had the sage. You had 7 plus.
The central leader, the figurehead, and then the 7 people around them, the 7 shining ones.
Yeah.
Which you find the same description in South America as you do in the Middle East.
Yes.
We've heard about the in ancient aliens, these shining people, and then you have the same description in South America. Well, they've got to be the same people. You don't describe people with that kind of characteristic unless there's something, an overlap in the story.
Yes.
And there was always one charismatic leader that held them all together. And he was always married to one of the women in the group. There's only one woman. Mm-hmm. Turns out she's the most important person. She's the wisdom keeper. She also is the carrier of the bloodline of the gods. Very important. But she was this leader was always married to the one woman in the group, who's also his sister, which I suspect is actually more symbolic than genetic, because that has its own problems. Yeah. If you start going in that direction, it's almost like the Templars were saying they're all brothers. Well, they're not. They call themselves brothers as a title of office, because they're all the same. So I suspect that's what they were talking about.
Absolutely. And I thought I'd probably, just to put a bit of context into this, I was just wondering whether you could mind describing what the Younger Dryas period was.
The Younger Dryas?
Yes.
A lesson
or the Dryases.
The Dryases. Well, it's named after an alpine flower that seems to survive the ice ages. There's 3 Dryas periods, essentially. They go back to about 13,500 BC, when the Earth appears to be hit by something very big. It turns the Earth upside down. And this is not just conjecture now, this is now going back to the Hopi and the Egyptians that said exactly the same thing. That back in that time, the Earth was actually upside down, and north was south, and vice versa. The Hopi called it world upside down. So you got 2 stories, opposite sides of the world, and they talk about the same thing. That starts off the first major ice period, called the Older Dryas. And then, 1,000 years later, you have the Old Dryas, just to confuse things. where the Earth just gets itself back on its feet again, and boom, we get hit by something else again. We go back into this tailspin. This is a time when the Earth actually stood still and actually went back on its axis. So to the point where they're talking about how the sun set where it now rises and rises where it now set. Again, and you find that in 4 different places around the world, so why would they make that up? And then you had another period, which is the Younger Dryas, which is the one we're all fascinated about, which basically began around 10,800 BC, where the Earth is again hit with major meteorites. We have now evidence of their fragments along the Carolina coast, all the way to Florida, called the Carolina Bays, and you see all of these impacts. They look like spherical little sort of fields all the way through the low-lying areas. And basically the survivors of that came from a high civilization. They had to rebuild a form of world of the gods, as they call it. And they had barely 1,100 years to get their act together before another major hit took place in 9,703 BC, Tuesday. According to the geological record in Iceland, and that closes off the Younger Dryas period. And now we're coming out of that ice age, and we're basically coming into this global warming period.
And they've recently found that crater in Greenland, haven't they?
That was one of them. Yes, 18 mile wide was it?
Yeah,
something very big. But most of those that ended the Younger Dryas were a result of the disintegrating comet hitting mostly the southern hemisphere and also deep water, which is why it's been so hard to figure out. And they found that the actual places where these comets hit in deep water, they were able to create tsunamis which were 3 miles high. Because the stories in Tibet say, oh, the waters of the flood, they crossed the Himalaya, and I'm thinking, okay, now they're really stretching the imagination. You're 3 miles above sea level. I spoke to someone at Los Alamos, ballistics department, as one does, of course, and I said, have you been doing any work with trajectories of things hitting deep water? And he said, actually, we have a paper on this. I thought, great. And it turns out that they actually were looking at this for whatever reason. And they said, yes, when you take the Earth, or any large body of water, you take a projectile of a certain size and shape at a certain velocity and a certain angle to the Earth's rotation. If it hits at exactly the right spots in deep trenches, say off the coast of Peru, where you have a very deep trench, the kinetic force will send a plume of water 3 miles high into the atmosphere. Now that leaves a hole. It's got to be filled with something. When water comes back down again, it will create a ripple effect, and you won't see it. You'll only feel the effect of massive waves in the Pacific Ocean, for example, which is what the Whiteheart story talks about. They lost one of their canoes because of the massive waves. So thank God they're in deep water and this is happening. Of course, when those ripples hit the coastal region, it regains its original height, which is 3 miles, and that's an actual peer-reviewed document. So the people in the Himalayas were not joking. They said, yes, entire mountains went down as quickly as they went up because the water came right through the Himalaya. There were ripples upon ripples upon ripples. Apparently this thing lasted for like 7 days. It was a complete backwards and forwards rippling effect. It's like you as a kid in your bathtub, You used to sort of slip into your bathtub, and of course the water keeps splashing backwards and forwards. That was what was happening. The Earth was recalibrating. There was tsunamis knocking upon each other and creating more ripple effects back where they came. The whole thing was like sitting in a big bathtub with big rocks.
What was quite interesting,